in the hushed silence of Westminster Hall, where history itself seemed to hold its breath, for small figures stood like living statues beside an ornate coffin. The youngest, barely 4 years old, clutched a tiny toy horse while trying to understand why Great-Granny was sleeping so still. The oldest, not yet 15, fought back tears that threatened to spill as cameras from around the world captured every trembling breath. This wasn't just another royal ceremony. This was the moment when childhood innocence met the weight of a 1,000-year-old crown, when grief wore the face of youth, and when the future of the British monarchy stood on the shoulders of children who had lost the one person who had always been simply gone to them. What unfolded over those sacred days would reveal not just the public face of royal duty, but the private heartbreak of great-grandchildren saying goodbye to the woman who had taught them to ride horses, bake scones, and carry themselves with quiet dignity. Their story, captured in stolen glances and brave smiles, would touch millions and forever change how the world sees the human side of royalty. This is their story, raw, real, and absolutely unforgettable. The morning of September 8th, 2022, started like any other Thursday for the youngest members of the royal family. Prince George was reviewing his homework at Lambert School, carefully practicing his handwriting while his younger sister Princess Charlotte giggled with her friends during morning break. Across the grounds, Prince Louis was building an elaborate tower with colorful blocks in his nursery classroom, his tongue poking out in concentration the way it always did when he was deeply focused. None of them knew that hundreds of miles away in Scotland, their beloved great-grandmother was slipping away from them with each passing hour. The first sign that something was different came when their father, Prince William, arrived at school earlier than usual. The headmaster met him at the entrance with an unusually serious expression, and teachers began quietly gathering the Wales children from their various activities. George noticed immediately that his father's face looked pale, and Charlotte sensed something was wrong when she saw her daddy's eyes were red-rimmed. At Frogmore Cottage, Prince Archie was playing in the garden with his nanny while his mother Meghan worked on her laptop nearby. The 4-year-old had been chasing butterflies among the late summer flowers, his laughter echoing across the peaceful grounds. His baby sister Princess Lilibet was napping in her crib, her tiny fist curled against her cheeks in the way that always made her parents smile. Prince Harry had been in London for meetings, but when his phone rang with an urgent call from his father, everything stopped. The conversation was brief, but devastating. The Queen, their grandmother, the woman who had been the steady heartbeat of their family for over 70 years, was failing rapidly. All family members needed to come to Balmoral immediately. The drive from London to Scotland had never felt longer. William gripped the steering wheel of his car tightly, his knuckles white as he navigated through traffic while his mind raced with memories. He thought about how his grandmother had always made special time for his children, how she would get down on the floor to play with them despite her age, how her eyes lit up whenever they entered a room. In the back seat, George stared out the window in silence. At 9 years old, he was beginning to understand the weight of what this might mean, not just for their family, but for the entire country. Charlotte, 7, kept asking quiet questions that her father struggled to answer honestly without frightening her. Why was Great-Granny so sick? Would she get better like when Charlotte had the flu? Why were all the grown-ups crying? 4-year-old Louis seemed to sense the gravity of the situation, even if he couldn't fully comprehend it. He clutched his favorite stuffed animal and kept asking when they would see Gone again. William's heart broke a little more with each innocent question, knowing that the answers would change their childhood forever. Meanwhile, Harry was making desperate arrangements to get to Scotland as quickly as possible. The logistics of traveling with young children, when every second counted, created an almost impossible situation. Meghan would stay with Archie and Lilibet, while Harry would fly alone to Balmoral, hoping against hope that he wouldn't be too late to say goodbye. The news broke to the public while the family was still traveling. Suddenly, the children's private grief became a matter of global concern. News anchors spoke in hushed tones about the Queen's condition, while cameras focused on every car arriving at Balmoral. Social media exploded with messages of concern and support, but also with intrusive speculation about how the youngest royals were coping. George, who had recently learned to read news headlines, saw the breaking news alert on his father's phone and felt a chill run down his spine. The words "Queen under medical supervision" made everything real in a way that adult conversations hadn't quite managed to do. As their car finally approached the gates of Balmoral, Charlotte pressed her face to the window and saw crowds of people holding flowers and signs. She didn't understand why strangers were crying for their great-grandmother, but she could feel the weight of all those eyes watching their family's most private moments. The castle felt different when they arrived. Staff members who usually greeted the children with warm smiles and playful jokes moved quietly through the halls with tears in their eyes. The normal sounds of a busy royal household had been replaced by hushed conversations and the soft closing of doors. King Charles, still adjusting to his new reality as monarch, embraced his grandchildren with a fierce tenderness that spoke of his own grief. The children had never seen their grandfather look so vulnerable, and it scared them in ways they couldn't articulate. The man who had always been strong and slightly formal with them suddenly seemed smaller, more human. Princess and took charge of practical arrangements with her characteristic efficiency, but even she paused to kneel down and speak gently to each of the children. Her usually brisk manner softened as she explained that great-granny was very peaceful and wasn't in any pain, that she was surrounded by love and would always watch over them. The hours that followed blurred together in a haze of whispered conversations, gentle embraces, and the strange feeling of waiting for something that everyone knew was inevitable, but no one wanted to accept. The children found themselves speaking in whispers without being asked to, instinctively understanding that this was a time for quiet reverence. When the end came at 3:10 p.m., the children were playing quietly in a sitting room nearby. The news was delivered to them gently, carefully, with words chosen to comfort rather than frighten. But despite all the preparation, despite the gentle explanations, the reality hit each child differently. George, as the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility settling on his young shoulders, even as grief washed over him. Charlotte cried quietly, the kind of tears that speak of deep understanding and loss. Louis, still so young, seemed confused by all the sadness around him, but cried because everyone else was crying. Harry, who had arrived just hours too late to say goodbye, held his nephews and niece close as they all struggled to process a world without the Queen. The woman who had been the constant in all their lives, the steady presence who had weathered every storm and celebrated every joy, was gone. The immediate aftermath brought a strange mixture of intense privacy and overwhelming public attention. While the family grieved behind closed doors, the entire world mourned with them. News of the Queen's passing dominated every channel, every newspaper, every social media platform. The children's grief became part of a global moment of loss and reflection. That evening, as the children were tucked into beds in the castle where their great-grandmother had just passed away, they asked questions that their parents struggled to answer. Would they still be princes and princesses? Would they still live in the same house? Would Christmas still happen at Sandringham? Would anyone remember Gone the way they did? The night sky over Scotland seemed darker than usual, as if even the stars were mourning. Inside Balmoral, for children fell asleep to the sound of their parents' quiet conversations drifting down the hallways, planning for a future none of them could quite imagine yet. The Queen was gone, but her legacy lived on in their memories, in their training, and in the love she had poured into each of them during their brief but precious time together. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, new protocols, and new ways of honoring her memory. But tonight, they were simply great-grandchildren missing their gone, holding on to the love she had given them, and trying to understand how to carry it forward into an uncertain future. The days following the Queen's death transformed the familiar rhythms of the children's lives into something unrecognizable. What had once been spontaneous family dinners and casual afternoons became carefully orchestrated moments under intense public scrutiny. Every movement, every expression, Every tear would be analyzed by millions of people around the world. Prince George woke up on September 9th to find his world fundamentally changed in ways he was only beginning to understand. The boy who had been third in line to the throne was now second, after his father, who had suddenly become the Prince of Wales overnight. The weight of this new reality pressed down on his 9-year-old shoulders as he dressed in the formal black clothes that had been laid out for him. Princess Charlotte discovered that being a royal in mourning meant following rules she had never heard of before. Her colorful dresses and playful hair ribbons were replaced with somber dark clothing and neat, simple hairstyles. The 7-year-old struggled to understand why expressing her natural exuberance now felt inappropriate, why her usual giggles and spontaneous hugs had to be carefully managed. 4-year-old Prince Louis found himself in a confusing world where the adults around him spoke in hushed tones and seemed constantly on the verge of tears. His questions about when they would see Gone again were met with gentle but evasive answers that only added to his confusion. The vibrant, energetic little boy who usually brought laughter wherever he went now moved more cautiously, sensing that his normal behavior might somehow be wrong. Back in California, Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet experienced their great-grandmother's death through the filter of their parents' grief and the sudden intensity of media attention surrounding their family. At 3 years old, Archie couldn't fully understand why his daddy was so sad or why there were suddenly photographers camping outside their home in Montecito. Baby Lilibet, not yet 2, simply knew that the atmosphere in their house had changed, that bedtime stories were interrupted by urgent phone calls, and that her parents' usual calm had been replaced by a kind of anxious energy. The first major test came with the decision about which children would attend the lying in state ceremony. Palace officials, grief counselors, and family members engaged in careful discussions about what would be appropriate for children of various ages. The public expected to see the Queen's great-grandchildren paying their respects, but the family was acutely aware that these were children dealing with genuine grief, not performers in a royal pageant. Catherine, now the Princess of Wales, found herself navigating the delicate balance between protecting her children's emotional well-being and preparing them for their public roles. She spent hours with each child individually, helping them understand what they would see and experience, teaching them coping strategies for managing overwhelming emotions in front of cameras and crowds. The conversations were heartbreaking in their necessity. She had to explain to George that his tears were normal and natural, but that he would need to be strong when people were watching because many people around the world were looking to their family for comfort and stability. She helped Charlotte understand that being sad was okay, but that showing respect for great-granny meant standing quietly and following the ceremonies carefully. With Louis, the discussions took on a different character entirely. How do you explain the concept of lying in state to a 4-year-old? How do you prepare a preschooler for the sight of his beloved great-grandmother in a coffin, surrounded by elaborate ceremony and thousands of mourners? Catherine found herself simplifying complex protocols in a language a young child could understand while being honest about the gravity of what they would experience. The decision about whether Harry's children would participate became more complicated due to the family's location in California and the complicated dynamics surrounding Harry and Meghan's relationship with the rest of the royal family. The logistics of travel, the young ages of Archie and Lilibet, and the desire to shield them from intense media scrutiny ultimately led to the decision that they would not attend the public ceremonies. This decision created its own emotional complications. Archie, despite his young age, understood that his cousins would be doing something important for Gone that he wouldn't be part of. The 3-year-old's questions about why he couldn't go to say goodbye to his great-grandmother added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Prince William struggled with his own grief while trying to guide his children through theirs. The man who had lost his mother at a young age and understood the particular pain of grieving in public now had to help his children navigate the same treacherous waters. He found himself drawing on memories of Princess Diana's funeral, remembering both the comfort and the burden of public mourning. The practical preparations for the lying in state were elaborate and emotionally challenging. The children had to practice walking slowly, standing for extended periods, and maintaining composure under intense observation. They learned about the specific protocols of the ceremony, the significance of the regalia, and the historical importance of Westminster Hall. George, as the eldest, took these preparations seriously, understanding that he was not just participating in a ceremony, but stepping into a role that would define the rest of his life. The boy who had always been protective of his younger siblings now felt an additional responsibility to model appropriate behavior for Charlotte and Louis. The night before the lying in state began, the Wales children had a private moment with their great-grandmother's coffin before it was moved to Westminster Hall. This intimate goodbye, away from cameras and crowds, allowed them to express their grief more freely and say personal farewells that would sustain them through the public ceremonies to come. Charlotte brought a small drawing she had made of herself and the Queen riding horses together, one of their favorite shared activities. She placed it carefully near the coffin and whispered a private message that only she and her great-grandmother would ever know. George stood quietly for several minutes, his young mind processing the finality of the moment and the weight of the responsibilities that lay ahead. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to understand the solemnity of the moment. He touched the coffin gently and said goodbye in his sweet, innocent voice, his words bringing tears to the eyes of every adult present. The 4-year-old's natural honesty and lack of pretense created a moment of pure emotional truth in the midst of elaborate protocol. The family's grief counselor worked with each child to prepare them for the intense emotions they might experience during the public ceremonies. They practiced breathing techniques for managing anxiety, discussed what to do if they became overwhelmed, and created signal systems with their parents for communicating needs without speaking. The evening before the lying in state began, Catherine tucked each child into bed with extra care and attention. She read them stories about courage and love, sang the lullabies the Queen had once sung to her own children and grandchildren, and held them close as they drifted off to sleep with questions still lingering in their young minds. The anticipation was overwhelming for all of them. Tomorrow, they would step into Westminster Hall before the eyes of the world and begin a journey that would test their emotional strength, their royal training, and their ability to honor their great-grandmother's memory while processing their own grief. The 4 young royals were about to discover just how heavy a crown could feel, even when it was made only of expectation and love. The morning of September 14th dawned gray and solemn over London, matching the mood of a nation preparing to say farewell to the only monarch most people had ever known. For Prince George, Princess Charlotte, and Prince Louis, it was the day they would step into Westminster Hall and stand beside their great-grandmother's coffin before hundreds of thousands of mourners and millions more watching around the world. The preparation began before sunrise. In their Kensington Palace apartment, the 3 children were dressed in their formal mourning clothes with extra care and attention. Every detail had been planned to honor tradition while acknowledging that these were grieving children, not adult royals. George's suit was impeccably tailored but comfortable enough for long periods of standing. Charlotte's black dress included subtle personal touches that the Queen would have appreciated. Louis, at 4, was dressed with special consideration for his young age and the likelihood that he might need comfort or adjustment during the ceremony. As their motorcade traveled through London streets toward Westminster, the children pressed their faces to the windows and saw something none of them had experienced before. Thousands upon thousands of people lined the roads, many holding flowers, many with tears streaming down their faces, all waiting patiently for their chance to pay respects to the Queen. The sight was both overwhelming and deeply moving for the young royals who were beginning to understand the true scope of their great-grandmother's impact on the world. Prince George felt the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders as their car approached Westminster Hall. At 9 years old, he was acutely aware that he was no longer just a child at a family gathering, but a future king participating in a historic moment that would be remembered for generations. The boy who had always been somewhat shy in public now had to find the courage to represent his family and his future role with dignity and grace. Princess Charlotte, sitting between her brothers, clutched a small lace handkerchief that had belonged to her great-grandmother, a private comfort that would help her through the difficult moments ahead. The 7-year-old had always been the most emotionally expressive of the 3 children, and she was struggling with the expectation that she contain her natural reactions while still honoring the grandmother she had loved so dearly. 4-year-old Louis, despite extensive preparation, was still too young to fully comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. He knew that this was an important and sad day, that he needed to be very good and very quiet, and that lots of people would be watching him. The pressure of performing perfect behavior at such a young age, while processing grief, was an enormous burden for such small shoulders. When they entered Westminster Hall, the children were struck by the absolute silence and the sheer scale of the ancient building. The medieval hall, with its soaring hammer-beam roof and stone walls that had witnessed nearly 1,000 years of English history, created an atmosphere of profound reverence that even young Louis could sense. The sight of their great-grandmother's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the glittering state crown, the orb, and the scepter, was both magnificent and heartbreaking. This ornate display of monarchy was so different from the cozy, warm woman who had taught them to make jam tarts and told them bedtime stories about her corgis. The contrast between their private memories and this public spectacle created a complex emotional response that each child processed differently. George approached the coffin with the careful, measured steps he had practiced, but his composure wavered slightly when he saw the personal touches that had been added by the family. The wreath of flowers from Balmoral Gardens, the card written in his grandfather's handwriting, the small personal mementos that connected this state ceremony to their private grief. For a moment, the 9-year-old's royal training gave way to genuine emotion as he struggled to reconcile the grandmother he knew with the monarch the world was mourning. Charlotte's reaction was more immediate and visceral. The 7-year-old had always worn her emotions openly, and seeing her great-grandmother lying so still and formal overwhelmed her carefully maintained composure. Her mother, Catherine, immediately moved closer to provide comfort and support, understanding that this moment was testing the limits of what could be expected from such a young child. The most poignant moment came when Louis, confused by the elaborate ceremony and the solemn faces around him, asked in a small, clear voice why Gongon wasn't waking up. His innocent question, audible in the profound silence of Westminster Hall, captured the heartbreak of the moment more powerfully than any formal eulogy could have done. The 4-year-old's genuine confusion and sadness reminded everyone present that beneath the pageantry and protocol, this was fundamentally about children losing someone they loved. The family formed a protective circle around the youngest members as they paid their respects. William stood close to George, ready to provide support if the weight of the moment became too much for his eldest son. Catherine positioned herself between Charlotte and Louis, prepared to comfort them or discreetly remove them if their emotional needs became overwhelming. The presence of the children at the lying-in state created some of the most memorable and touching images of the entire period of mourning. Their genuine grief, their attempts to follow royal protocol despite their young ages, and their obvious love for their great-grandmother resonated with people around the world who were watching and grieving alongside them. But perhaps more importantly for the children themselves, this moment began their real understanding of what it meant to be royal in the modern world. They were learning that their private emotions would always be public property, that their grief would be shared with millions of strangers, and that their behavior in moments of personal pain would be scrutinized and judged by people they would never meet. George later described feeling like he was in a movie or a dream, unable to fully process that this elaborate ceremony was really happening to his family. The 9-year-old was beginning to understand that his life would always involve this strange mixture of public performance and private feeling, that he would need to learn to grieve and celebrate and live his life in front of cameras and crowds. Charlotte found comfort in the hundreds of thousands of people who came to pay their respects over the following days. Seeing how many people loved her great-grandmother helped her understand that her grief was shared by countless others, that the Queen's death was a loss that extended far beyond their family. The 7-year-old began to see herself as part of a much larger community of mourners. Louis, despite his young age, seemed to absorb the gravity and solemnity of the occasions in ways that surprised the adults around him. The 4-year-old's natural empathy allowed him to sense the emotional needs of others, and he often provided unexpected comfort to his siblings and parents simply through his honest reactions and innocent observations. The hours spent in Westminster Hall were emotionally exhausting for all 3 children. The combination of grief, public pressure, and the need to maintain appropriate behavior for extended periods tested their physical and emotional limits. By the end of each session, they were drained but also somehow strengthened by the experience of honoring their great-grandmother in such a meaningful way. The public response to the children's participation was overwhelmingly positive and supportive. People around the world were moved by their courage, their obvious love for their great-grandmother, and their attempts to fulfill their royal duties despite their young ages and genuine grief. The children became symbols of hope and continuity, representing the future of the monarchy while honoring its past. For George, Charlotte, and Louis, the lying in state was their first real taste of what their adult lives would likely hold. They learned that being royal meant sharing their most personal moments with the public, that their emotions would be subject to global scrutiny, and that they would need to find strength they didn't know they possessed in order to serve their roles with dignity and grace. It was a harsh but necessary lesson in the realities of their extraordinary lives. The 4 days of lying in state at Westminster Hall became a transformative experience not just for the royal family, but for the entire nation. As hundreds of thousands of mourners queued for hours, sometimes in harsh weather, to pay their final respects to Queen Elizabeth II, her great-grandchildren found themselves at the center of a remarkable demonstration of public affection and shared grief. Prince George discovered during this period that his presence at the lying in state meant more to people than he had ever imagined possible. The 9-year-old began to understand that he wasn't just mourning his great-grandmother as a beloved family member, but as a symbol of stability and continuity that millions of people around the world had relied upon. When he stood quietly beside the coffin, his composed demeanor gave comfort to countless mourners who saw in him the promise that the monarchy would continue with the same dedication and service that had defined the Queen's remarkable reign. The queue to view the Queen's coffin, which stretched for miles along the Thames and took people up to 24 hours to complete, became a pilgrimage of sorts. People from all walks of life, from every corner of the United Kingdom and beyond, waited patiently for their brief moment to pay respects. Many of them specifically mentioned seeing the Queen's great-grandchildren as one of the most moving aspects of their experience. Princess Charlotte, despite her young age, began to grasp the profound impact her great-grandmother had made on individual lives. As she stood in Westminster Hall, she could see the faces of the people filing past the coffin. Some were elderly, clearly remembering the Queen's coronation and the early decades of her reign. Others were young families with children her own age, teaching their sons and daughters about the importance of service and duty. The 7-year-old princess saw tears, smiles of fond memory, and expressions of deep respect that helped her understand that her great-grandmother's death was a loss shared by millions. The international response was equally profound and educational for the children. Messages of condolence poured in from world leaders, ordinary citizens, and fellow children from around the globe. George received letters from young people who would one day lead their own countries, expressing their sympathy and sharing their own memories of meeting the Queen. These communications helped him begin to understand the global nature of his family's role and the relationships that extend far beyond the borders of the United Kingdom. 4-year-old Prince Louis while still too young to fully comprehend the historical significance of the moment, absorbed the emotional atmosphere in ways that would shape his understanding for years to come. His questions about why so many people were sad, why everyone wanted to see Gone, and why there were so many flowers everywhere prompted conversations that began his education about service, duty, and the special relationship between the royal family and the people they serve. The children's participation in the lying state also provided important lessons about different ways of expressing grief and showing respect. They observed how people from different cultures and backgrounds approached the coffin, how some prayed silently while others stood with military precision, how children their own age tried to understand the magnitude of the moment while adults guided them with gentle explanations. Catherine and William used these observations as teaching moments, helping their children understand that there is no single right way to mourn or to show respect, that the diversity of responses they were witnessing reflected the Queen's role as a monarch for all people, regardless of their background, beliefs, or circumstances. The media coverage during this period was intensive, but generally respectful, focusing on the children's courage and composure rather than exploiting their grief for sensational headlines. George, Charlotte, and Louis began to understand how their public appearances would always be documented and analyzed, but also how their behavior could inspire and comfort others who were facing their own difficult times. Behind the scenes, the family worked carefully to balance the children's public duties with their need for private time to process their emotions. Between public appearances, they retreated to quiet spaces where the children could ask questions, express their feelings freely, and receive the comfort and support they needed from their parents and other family members. The Queen's lying in state also brought the extended royal family together in unprecedented ways. Cousins who lived on different continents suddenly found themselves sharing hotel rooms and meals, creating bonds that would last long after the formal mourning period ended. For the children, this gathering provided a sense of support and solidarity that helped them feel less alone in their grief and their unique circumstances. Prince Harry's participation in the ceremonies, despite the ongoing tensions within the family, was particularly meaningful for the children. George, Charlotte, and Louis needed to see that family bonds could transcend disagreements, and that love and respect for their great-grandmother united them all, regardless of other complications. Harry's presence provided continuity with their memories of happier family gatherings and reminded them that some things are more important than conflict. The children also learned about the practical aspects of royal protocol during this period. They discovered how ceremonies are planned and coordinated, how security works to protect both the family and the public, and how tradition and innovation can work together to create meaningful experiences. George, as the future king, paid particular attention to these details, beginning to understand the complexity of the role he would one day assume. The flowers, tributes, and messages left by mourners created an ever-growing memorial that fascinated the children. Charlotte was particularly moved by the letters and drawings left by children around the world, many of whom shared their own memories of grandparents they had lost or expressed their hopes for the future of the monarchy. These personal messages helped her understand that grief is a universal experience that connects people across all boundaries. The period of lying in state also revealed the strength and resilience that the Queen had passed down to her great-grandchildren. Despite their young ages and the unprecedented circumstances, all three children demonstrated remarkable composure and maturity. Their ability to fulfill their duties while processing genuine grief showed qualities that would serve them well throughout their lives as members of the royal family. As the lying in state period drew to a close, the children began to understand that their formal goodbye to their great-grandmother was just the beginning of a lifetime of carrying forward her legacy. The lessons they learned during those intense days about service, dignity, compassion, and resilience would shape their approach to their royal roles for decades to come. The final night before the state funeral, the three Wales children had one last private moment with their great-grandmother's coffin. In the quiet of Westminster Hall, away from cameras and crowds, They said their personal farewells and made promises to honor her memory through their future actions and service. It was a moment that marked the end of their childhood in many ways, but also the beginning of their true understanding of what it means to be royal in the modern world. The morning of September 19th, 2022, dawned with a weight of finality that only comes with the most significant farewells. As London prepared for Queen Elizabeth II's state funeral, her great-grandchildren faced their ultimate test of courage, composure, and love. This would be their final public goodbye to the woman who had shaped their understanding of duty, service, and unconditional love. Prince George woke before dawn, his mind already focused on the day ahead. The 9-year-old had spent the previous evening quietly reviewing the funeral program with his father, asking thoughtful questions about the music, the readings, and the significance of each element of the ceremony. He understood that this day would be different from the lying in state, that the finality of the funeral service would mark the true end of an era for his family and his country. The young prince had grown visibly during the days of mourning, not just in his understanding of his royal role, but in his appreciation for the profound responsibility he would one day inherit. The boy who had once seen his future as an abstract concept now understood that being king meant serving as a source of stability and comfort for millions of people during their most difficult times. Princess Charlotte approached the day with a mixture of sadness and determination that surprised the adults around her. The 7-year-old had found strength in the outpouring of love for her great-grandmother, and she was determined to honor that legacy through her behavior during the funeral. She had chosen to wear a small horseshoe brooch, a gift from the Queen that symbolized their shared love of horses and their special bond. Charlotte had spent the previous days writing letters to her great-grandmother that she would never send, expressing her feelings and making promises about the kind of person she wanted to become. The exercise had helped her process her grief, while also clarifying her own values and aspirations. She understood now that being a princess meant more than wearing beautiful dresses and attending grand events. It meant using her position to make a positive difference in the world. 4-year-old Prince Louis faced the day with the resilience that only very young children possess. While he couldn't fully comprehend the historical significance of the state funeral, he understood that this was the most important day for saying goodbye to Gongon. His parents had prepared him carefully, explaining that there would be lots of people, beautiful music, and important words about how much everyone loved his great-grandmother. The little prince had been given special responsibilities that were appropriate for his age, small ways to participate that would help him feel included without overwhelming him. He carried a simple prayer card with a picture of the Queen, and he had been taught a special wave that he could use if he felt happy during the ceremony, showing people that he was okay and grateful for their love. Westminster Abbey, with its soaring Gothic architecture and centuries of royal history, provided a magnificent but intimidating setting for the funeral. As the family entered the ancient building, the children were struck by the presence of world leaders, foreign royalty, and thousands of invited guests, all gathered to honor their great-grandmother's extraordinary life and reign. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of pageantry and emotion, combining the grandeur of state occasions with the intimacy of personal grief. The children listened to readings from texts the Queen had chosen, heard music that had been meaningful to her throughout her life, and participated in prayers that reflected her deep Christian faith. George found himself deeply moved by the Archbishop of Canterbury's sermon, which spoke about the Queen's unwavering dedication to service and her ability to find joy and hope even in difficult times. The 9-year-old began to understand that his great-grandmother's legacy wasn't just about tradition and ceremony, but about the daily choice to serve others with grace and dignity. Charlotte was particularly touched by the hymn, "The Lord's My Shepherd," which the Queen had requested be sung at her wedding to Prince Philip more than 70 years earlier. The 7-year-old understood that this music connected her great-grandmother's entire life story, from young bride to beloved monarch, and she felt honored to be part of that continuing narrative. Louis, despite his young age, remained remarkably composed throughout the lengthy service. When he grew restless, his mother provided gentle comfort and quiet distraction. But for most of the ceremony, the 4-year-old seemed to absorb the solemnity and significance of the moment in ways that touched everyone who observed him. The procession from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch was both magnificent and emotionally overwhelming. As the children traveled through London streets behind their great-grandmother's coffin, they saw hundreds of thousands of people lining the route, many throwing flowers and calling out messages of love and support. The sight of an entire city united in grief and gratitude provided a powerful lesson about the impact one person can have on the world. The children's composure during this final journey impressed observers around the world, but it was their obvious, genuine emotion that truly moved people. They weren't simply performing royal duty. They were saying goodbye to someone they loved deeply, and their courage in doing so publicly provided comfort to countless others who were grieving alongside them. The final moments at Windsor Castle, where the Queen would be buried beside Prince Philip in a private family service, offered the children their most personal farewell. Away from the cameras and crowds, they could express their emotions more freely and say the private words that meant the most to them. George placed a handwritten note beside the coffin, promising to honor his great-grandmother's memory through his future service as king. Charlotte left a small bouquet of flowers she had picked from the gardens at Kensington Palace, flowers that reminded her of the gardening lessons she had shared with the Queen. Louis, with help from his father, placed his favorite toy horse near the coffin, a gift that symbolized all the joy and laughter his great-grandmother had brought to his young life. In the days and weeks that followed the funeral, the children began the long process of integrating their grief and moving forward with their lives. They returned to school, to their normal routines, and to the ordinary challenges of childhood, but they carried with them a new understanding of their roles, their responsibilities, and their capacity for strength in difficult times. George threw himself into his studies with renewed purpose, understanding now that his education wasn't just about personal growth, but about preparing to serve his future subjects effectively. Charlotte became more interested in charitable work, inspired by her great-grandmother's dedication to hundreds of organizations and causes. Louis, while still very young, showed increased empathy and kindness toward others, qualities that his great-grandmother had modeled throughout her life. The experience of participating in the Queen's lying in state and funeral had transformed these children from ordinary royals dealing with family grief into symbols of continuity, hope, and resilience. They had learned that their private emotions would always be public property, but they had also discovered that their courage and composure could provide comfort and inspiration to millions of people. Perhaps most importantly, they had internalized the Queen's most fundamental lesson: that true nobility comes not from titles or privilege, but from the daily choice to serve others with humility, grace, and unwavering dedication. The children who had entered Westminster Hall as grieving great-grandchildren emerged as young royals ready to carry forward a legacy of service that would define the rest of their lives. Their great-grandmother's final gift to them had been the knowledge that they possessed the strength, character, and love necessary to honor her memory while building their own paths forward. In learning to say goodbye with dignity and grace, they had also learned how to live with purpose and hope, ensuring that Queen Elizabeth II's remarkable legacy would continue through their own service to others in the years to come.